James's wife, Emma, upon learning he was infertile, grew distant and eventually left for another man. Her family and friends reached out, but James refused to help. It's common to hear statements like, "I never saw it coming." That's exactly how it was for him. Though James had been married to Emma for 4 years, he honestly thought they were doing well. For the most part, he thought they were in accord. They had a life plan in place. The difficulty was that James felt they both wanted children. They started serious discussions about it as soon as they got married. She would continually emphasize her wish for 2 or 3 children, droning on about the names they would give them, nursery decor, and other details. She would even spend hours online planning their future children's lives, browsing baby goods and clothing. It kept them linked and provided a topic for discussion. They were excited to begin this new chapter in their lives together, and everything seemed to be going as planned. But then they got some horrible news, which devastated James. After a few months of attempting to conceive, they went to the doctor to figure out what was happening. To shorten a long story short, it was James. The doctor essentially told them that their chances of naturally becoming parents were slim because his count was far too low. It felt like a stomach punch. James felt unworthy. Their entire set of plans went up in an instant. The news hit him hard, incredibly hard. He found himself in a bad situation for a while. He was a total catastrophe at first, but therapy eventually helped. At first, Emma appeared to be quite supportive, saying that it didn't matter and that she would be okay with just the 2 of them. However, there was something off about the way she said it. From the outset, she appeared to have dropped it way too quickly. She was all about creating a family 1 minute, and then suddenly said she didn't need children to be happy. James understood that people's opinions evolve, but her entire behavior struck him as weird. She had stopped talking about children since she was preoccupied with baby names. Furthermore, it appeared that she began to perceive James in a different light. She would suddenly start making tiny barbs at him, something she had never done before. She would make comments about how he wasn't taking care of himself, how he should exercise, or how he should be more productive at home. Yes, James could have gained a few pounds, but it appeared like she was always looking for reasons to accuse him of something. When he asked her about the dramatic change in attitude, she dismissed it. She said that he was very sensitive and was just imagining things. But James knew there was something wrong. She was not like the woman he married, who would sit with him for hours discussing their future plans. She wasn't particularly harsh, but she had a frigid demeanor about her, as if she had already checked out mentally and was only acting. James thought, as time passed, he grew to trust her when she assured him that everything was fine. He didn't want to come across as needy or insecure, so he stopped pursuing the topic. In any event, after a few years, they were barely getting by. They had fallen into a practice of rarely discussing anything serious. They seemed like housemates rather than husband and wife. She would consistently ignore James's attempts to discuss alternative options, such as adoption or surrogacy, by declaring that she did not want to consider them. James never believed her when she said, "As long as we're together, I'm happy." She seemed more interested in convincing herself than convincing him. She suddenly informed James that she wanted to go on a girls' trip. It wasn't unusual for her to travel with her buddies. She had done it several times previously, and James had always supported her. She had long expressed a desire to visit America with her friends while they were living in Brighton. They had built trust over the years, so James didn't give it much attention. He ensured she had everything she needed, helped her pack, and took her to the airport. James remembered her final remarks before she left. She looked at him and said, "Thank you for being so supportive." He found it unusual that she would say that when he hadn't done anything particularly spectacular, but she appeared so earnest that he discounted it as a simple expression of gratitude. That night, James stayed up to ensure everything ran perfectly. He called her when she came, kept himself busy about the house, watched TV, kept track of the time, and waited for her to text him to let him know she had arrived. Her flight was supposed to take about 9 hours, so he wasn't too concerned at first. When he realized her flight had landed, he contacted her to check in. The phone continued ringing, but no one answered. James didn't give it much attention. He figured she was fatigued and had gone straight to her hotel to rest. However, as morning dawned and he still hadn't heard from her, an annoying worry crept in. He assumed she was merely busy or her phone was on silent, so he tried calling again and texted her a few times. After a few more hours of radio silence, James was completely freaked out. Finally, he called her sister to see if she'd heard from Emma. Nothing. James was starting to panic, in the hopes that something had gone wrong with her phone, or that she just hadn't had time to check in. He even called her purported travel companions. However, they were equally bewildered as he was when he contacted them. They said they hadn't joined her on the vacation. They were actually sitting in a cafe just 2 streets away from their house, drinking their morning coffee. That's when it really hit James. She was not traveling with any other girls. She had no friends with her. She hadn't traveled with anyone. She had simply disappeared. His stomach felt like it had fallen through the floor as he sat there holding the phone. He couldn't understand it. Why would she tell him that lie? Why didn't she tell him before leaving? James tried to tell himself that it was a mistake. Perhaps she had missed a connecting flight or was delayed due to an emergency, but deep inside, he knew the truth. She had planned it. Her stating, "Thank you for being so supportive," and the entire story of a girl's trip were all part of whatever plan she had in mind. James was at a loss for what to do. It seemed like he was locked in a nightmare, unable to awaken. He'd never married a woman like her. He didn't even recognize the person. The coldness, the fact that she had stopped discussing their future, and the subtle jabs at his appearance and health, all of this immediately made sense. James just hadn't noticed. Perhaps he didn't want to see that she'd been drifting away for a time. He just sat there that night, staring at his phone, waiting for a call, a text, anything. However, nothing happened, and he knew it wouldn't. James remembered lying there, staring at the ceiling, and when he awoke the next morning, he assumed it was all a bad dream. However, when he noticed that her side of the bed was vacant, reality hit him. She had actually left. After she packed her bag, she vanished. The promises James had made to himself the previous evening, maybe she was late, maybe her phone died, were no longer legitimate. She had plainly planned it. She wanted to leave. James was in utter denial for the first few days. He kept contacting her phone, wanting to hear her voice and get an explanation. He even left messages, hoping she'd respond. He struggled to find words half of the time, but he kept trying. However, all he got in return was quiet. Strangely, the silence made matters worse. It was as if he'd always been a stranger to her, left alone to figure out what had gone wrong. Her family was originally as astonished as James was. They had not heard from her, and her mother had no idea of her plans. In the end, James visited her family more times than he could count, desperate to meet with her mother and gain some answers. They must have felt bad for him. When James couldn't bring himself to cook, her mother would make dinners for him. She occasionally allowed him to stay at their home. She'd sit with him as he talked about all the little things that didn't make sense, trying to figure out why his life had suddenly become so complicated. To be honest, there were times when James felt too numb to talk. He would simply sit there in solitude. He alternated between wrath, sorrow, and guilt. What went wrong? He kept asking himself. Was there a sign that he missed? Wasn't he paying enough attention to her? On certain days, James would go over all of their disputes and chats, attempting to figure out what had caused her to leave. He kept thinking about what he should have done better to save their marriage. It may sound dramatic, but he was possessed by the desire to find it out. He clung to the hope that obtaining the answer would somehow improve everything. James barely slept. He barely ate. His productivity began to decrease. People began to notice. When people inquired about his well-being, he would dismiss it, saying he was preoccupied with personal concerns. Admitting the truth that Emma had abandoned him without saying anything was too embarrassing. James eventually confided in a few close pals. They did their utmost to divert him by taking him out and pushing him to move on, but even when he was among them, his thoughts kept going to her. Where was she? Why wasn't he enough for her to stay? One of the most difficult parts was the constant inquiry from others, neighbors, relatives, acquaintances, and even former coworkers who had learned he was married. Each time someone inquired, "How's married life treating you?" or "How's your wife?" it was like peeling off a new scab. James would simply grin and fib, assuring them everything was all right, but each time he said that lie, it felt heavier. Finally, treatment proved to be the only thing that helped. James had never gone before, but after months of barely functioning, he realized he couldn't do it alone. He needed to speak with someone who was neutral and did not carry the weight of their common experience. He contacted a therapist and began attending weekly sessions. It helped. He talked constantly about her fury, betrayal, and the hole she had left behind. He talked about the sleepless nights, about lying awake and replaying every scene over and over. The therapist let him realize something he had not been able to accept. If she really wanted to stay, she would have. It was not his fault she decided to depart. That was a difficult pill to swallow. For a long time, James believed himself flawed and had somehow turned her away. However, he eventually came to see things differently. He chose to ignore her long-standing coldness and isolation, believing that things would improve on their own. He had convinced himself that if he just kept his cool and put in enough effort, he could save their marriage by himself. The revelation that he couldn't, that nothing was ever enough, hurt. As time passed, James started rebuilding his life, piece by piece. It wasn't until she left that he realized how much he'd lost in their marriage. He had always tried his hardest to make her happy and to keep their home life comfortable. But now, with so much free time, he was at a loss for what to do. So he began revisiting old pastimes that he had long forgotten. He tried making fresh meals. He went to the gymnasium. He started reading novels that he'd been putting off for years. Finally, his work improved. At first, he was just going through the motions, barely keeping up. However, when he began to feel more like himself, he increased his effort at work. It was one of the few things he still felt in control of, and it gave him a sense of success. He'd always been brilliant at what he did, but now he threw himself entirely into it. The extra hours, the focus, they paid off. James got a promotion, something he would not have accomplished if he had spent all of his time drowning in his sadness. Nevertheless, there were difficult days. A picture, an old movie ticket stub, or another minor memory would abruptly transport James back to the past. He'd find himself wondering if she ever thought about him or regretted what she'd done. But as time passed, those instances got fewer and farther apart. Each time, it grew a little easier to let go. James also reconnected with people he had lost touch with after getting married. They went trekking, they went to the golf range. He began doing activities that he hadn't done in years. Having friends by his side, people who weren't caught up in the turmoil and could support him without dragging him back into the pain, was a huge comfort. Looking back, James realized he had invested too much of himself in that connection. As her husband, he had lost a huge part of himself when she departed. It felt as if she had stolen a piece of him with her. However, he was gradually rediscovering himself. It was not quick, it was not easy, but he was making progress. At the end of that year, when James looked in the mirror, he saw more than simply a man whose wife had abandoned him. He'd rebuilt. He had survived. He was stronger now. For the first time in years, he felt free to live his life without her shadow lurking over him, and he took pride in it. James genuinely thought he'd moved on from everything. After all of the commotion, things had begun to feel normal again, or as normal as they could be. Work was progressing smoothly. His friends kept him busy. He had a routine down. Even his thoughts of her had disappeared. Sure, there were occasional flashbacks, odd recollections that appeared unexpectedly, but they weren't as often as previously, when everything he did seemed to be linked to her. She was the last person James expected to see standing outside his door on Saturday morning, but there she was. Emma held a baby in her arms. James got chilled. It was like witnessing a ghost. For a little while, his brain ceased to operate. She appeared nearly identical, perhaps a touch worn down, but otherwise unchanged. And the way she looked at him, as if she truly believed he would be delighted to see her, moved him. James thought he had stopped caring, but meeting her again resurfaced emotions he had long suppressed. For a minute, he stood there in silence, staring. She smiled as if nothing had happened and asked, "May I come in?" A nerve after everything she had done, she simply walked up here, expecting James to welcome her back with open arms. However, he kept his cool and told her, "No, you can stay right there." He said that he did not want her in his home, bringing all of the chaos back into the place he had established for himself. Despite her bewildered demeanor, she remained where she was and simply began her story. She started by saying, "I know this may come as a shock, but I wanted to come back and explain everything." Her look was hopeful, as if she genuinely felt James would be eager to listen. He was tempted to simply close the door in her face, perhaps even laugh, but he was too curious. He was curious about the reason for her disappearance and the tale she had come up with. She went on to say that she had made a mistake in leaving and had now recognized that she had lost the best thing that had ever occurred to her, not James's words, but hers. She claimed that after much thought and after having this child, she had finally realized what was truly essential in life. After years of ignoring him, it appeared that what was most important had unexpectedly brought her back to his doorstep. "This is our second chance," she said, looking down at the newborn. What James was hearing was incredible, our second chance. As if this child were some sort of miraculous reset button, allowing them to resume where they left off. He was outraged on the inside, but his expression remained neutral. She went on to suggest that despite having made a terrible mistake, they could now start over. Just the three of them. She wanted them to be a family again. Why did you leave? That was the question that had haunted James since she first appeared. He tried to keep his voice steady, but he wasn't sure how long he could do it. Now that she was present, he needed to hear the truth. For years, he had tortured himself with unlimited possibilities, attempting to make sense of everything. She hesitated, looking down at her feet as if embarrassed. Then she finally said it, or at least what she said was true. She stated that she had gone because she wanted a child, and she had found someone who could provide one because James could not. She spoke nonchalantly, as if it were insignificant, as if she hadn't ruined his life, as if he should simply nod, accept, and go on. She went on to explain that while the man she had left James for did not remain, she had already given birth and had realized she wanted him back. How convenient. James paused to digest what she was saying. She was standing here confessing that she had abandoned him, fled with another guy, had his child, and now expected James to simply accept it, to pretend that none of this had ever occurred. So you left, found someone else, had his baby, and now you think you can just come back and pretend like nothing happened? James responded with curiosity. She burst into tears and apologized repeatedly, acknowledging she had made a tremendous mistake. James remained unaffected. She kept talking, attempting to persuade him that she knew she was meant to be with him, that he was the person she actually loved. To be honest, it was difficult to maintain a straight face. She sounded deluded. The desperation was written all over her face. It wasn't love that brought her back, it was terror. Then she attempted to guilt-trip James. She went on and on about how tough it had been for her as a single mother, as if she were the victim in this whole situation, as if her own decisions had not brought her here. She assured him that this time she was prepared to make it work. She said she needed his help. All James could think was, "Who does she think I am?" He let her continue. He stood there listening. Then he'd had enough. "You made your choice a long time ago," James informed her, "and now you have to live with it. There's no second chance here." She appeared shocked, as if she had never considered the possibility that he might say no. as if she actually believed she could simply walk back into his life whenever it suited her. Then she felt enraged. Just when James thought she'd finally get it and leave, she lashed out, accusing him of being selfish. She demanded that he give her another chance and let her repair things. She even had the nerve to say, "I could have taken half of everything and divorced you back then if I wanted to." And then she said it. The house should still be hers. At that point, James felt a burst of relief. Her disguise had finally slipped. Finally, he was seeing her actual self. He did not argue. He did not yell. He simply looked her in the eye and replied, "We're done. You wanted a different life, and now you have it. This is no longer my responsibility." James simply stated, staring at her. Then he closed the door in her face, interrupting her mid-sentence. He was not interested in hearing what else she had to say. As James stood there listening to her muffled screaming from the other side of the door, he felt strangely calm. She had the ability to shout, cry, and knock at will, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never allow her back in. The woman James had once loved and married no longer existed. In her place stood a stranger, a self-centered, entitled stranger who believed she could pick up the pieces whenever it suited her. He stepped away from the door and sat down, feeling lighter than he had in years. James assumed that was the end of it. He figured she would eventually understand and walk away. But no, instead she began hammering on the door, screaming various things. Her bravery was admirable. She had the guts to stand up and insist that James listen to her. Here at his door, the one spot he fought to recapture after she abandoned him. At first, James pondered ignoring her and letting her scream until she got exhausted, but then curiosity got the better of him. He was curious what kind of excuse she would come up with this time. So he opened the door just enough to let her know he was listening, not enough to allow her in. She appeared stunned, as if she'd just been smacked, as if she expected him to react differently, as if they were simply having a usual dispute rather than coping with the implications of her abandonment. Then she began a long monologue. She expressed her willingness to forgive James for closing the door on her, about her desire to start over. She went on and on about how, if they both worked hard, they could get things fixed. And that's when James lost it. He laughed, not simply a chuckle, a full, sincere, and unrestrained laugh, because this woman possessed more nerve than he had ever seen. When he did, she snapped. She was enraged, as if James had harmed her, as if he were the one who should feel guilty. "You left," James informed her, his tone even. "You had your chance, and you threw it all away. I'm not just going to pretend none of that happened because you feel like it." Her face turned crimson. Then she started talking about how lost she had felt after leaving. She discovered her mistake too late. "You don't understand how hard it was for me," she told him. James didn't believe any of it. "No," he replied. "You made the decision to leave. You planned it. You lied about it, and then you went through with it." James scoffed. "Now your regret means nothing." And that's when she finally gave up the act. Her entire demeanor changed. The gloomy, remorseful woman was gone. In her place was the bitter, greedy individual she had always been. She attacked James. She accused him of being harsh and not having the grace to give her another chance. Then she said it. "If I'd wanted to, I could have taken everything from you back then. I could have taken half of everything you own." She genuinely stated that. James just stood there, staring at her in bewilderment. This woman who had abandoned him without saying anything now claimed she deserved something for not screwing him over even more, as if she deserved recognition for not being as bad as she could have been. "So what? Am I supposed to be grateful?" James requested an explanation. "Grateful that you only ditched me and didn't take my stuff too?" Her expression shifted between wrath, desperation, and remorse, but James didn't care anymore. That was it. That was the point at which all of the years he had spent questioning himself, wondering if he had done something wrong, vanished. For the first time in years, he saw her as she truly was. He felt free. But she wasn't done. She began pacing his porch. shouting about how he'd regret not giving her another chance, how he'd never find somebody like her again. She even tried to make it appear as if James was the one losing, as if she were the prize. It was surreal. This was the same woman who had demolished everything they'd constructed. Yet there she was, acting as if James should be asking her to stay. When she realized he wasn't going to cave, she grew louder. She began ranting about how James forced her to leave in the first place. She claimed that none of this would have occurred if he had been more accepting of the entire kid scenario. Her rationale was perplexing. She was actually implying that James had failed her as a husband because he was unable to conceive, as if this validated her decision to have a child with someone else. The mental gymnastics were incredible. To be honest, James was stunned that she was attempting to blame him for her actions. James glanced at her and commented, "Look, if you wanted a kid that badly, you could have just told me the truth. You didn't have to lie to my face and pretend everything was fine while planning your escape." She gave no response. She simply gazed at him as if he had hit her, but James did not let her talk. "You made that decision entirely on your own," he continued, "and now you have to live with it. That's not my problem." She made one last attempt. Her face returned to that depressed expression, and she pleaded with James to think about the boy. She said he was being unjust by ignoring him. She tried to make James feel guilty by holding the youngster in her arms, as if he were the villain in this scenario. But James was not buying into it. "I don't know that child," he informed her firmly. "I have nothing to do with him. He's not mine, and neither are you." That was it. James noticed it in her eyes. For the first time, she understood. She understood that he would never change his opinion. He would never allow her back into his life. The wrath in her expression dissipated, to be replaced by something else, perhaps regret. Or maybe she was just frustrated because her manipulation wasn't working. James didn't care. She had expected him to fold, forgive, and accept her back, but she was nothing to him now. She waited there for a few more seconds, as if waiting for him to reconsider his decision. James didn't utter another word, and as it dawned on her that he meant every word, he stood there observing her. Then he closed the door. This time, he did not wait for her to knock again. This time, he knew in his heart that he'd already made up his mind. There was no turning back. James wasn't sure why, but he felt like he had finally won. It ended as he moved away from the door. She'd spent a lot of time attempting to manipulate her way back into his life, but he had freedom. There would be no second chances for either her or them. She was now merely a memory, something James had finally put behind him, and for the first time in years, he felt as if he could breathe again. After so many years of pain and guilt, he felt at peace. And you know what? It was pleasurable. When James closed the door behind her, he felt a strange sensation of calm sweep over him. He no longer felt sad. He was not furious. He wasn't even astonished anymore. It was as if all the years of effort he had put into her had vanished along with the pain, guilt, and never-ending wondering. James was prepared to go on because he had finally received the closure he had never known he needed. This time, it was really over. However, life never ends smoothly. A few days later, James received a text from her mother. She apologized. She expressed her embarrassment at how her daughter had handled everything. She had tried to reason with her, but it was evident that it had not worked. Her mother was a kind woman. She had been kind to James when Emma departed, and he could tell she was genuinely upset about the situation. James didn't have anything against her, however. He did not want to be dragged back into any of it. So he just answered, "Thanks for checking in," and left it at that. He wasn't going to waste time justifying his decisions, and he wasn't going to give her mother any additional information. She knew it was over because she understood. Over the next few weeks, James discovered bits and pieces via social media and mutual relationships. Emma had allegedly moved back in with her parents, and things were not going well. The child's father, the man she had left James for, was not involved at all. He had bailed. She was left to figure things out on her own, as he had apparently not committed to the long term. Few people wanted to help her. She'd burned almost every bridge. Her previous acquaintances, many of whom had backed James when she initially went missing, had little sympathy for her. They were not about to get drawn back into her drama. They'd all moved on, and frankly, you can't blame them. Even her parents weren't pleased. They did not have the financial resources to maintain her and the child. James knew this because immediately after her mother texted him, her father called. Curiosity got the best of James. He almost didn't respond. Her father was clear yet respectful. He added that they were hurting financially and quietly suggested that James might be able to assist them. He spoke about the youngster and how terrible things were for them. "We know you cared about her once," the man added. James listened politely, but the irony of the situation made him laugh within. Then he went on and on about how his daughter only needed a little support to get back on her feet. That's when James joined in. "Your daughter made her choices," he said, his voice calm but forceful. "I am neither in a position nor in the right frame of mind to help her." He didn't press the subject. James believed he received the message. Then, out of nowhere, individuals James hadn't communicated with in years, her old friends began to reach out. Some attempted to use guilt, telling him that she was struggling and that he should find it in his heart to give her another chance. One even had the guts to suggest, "The child requires a father figure. Do not let resentment prevent you from doing the right thing." James refused to back down. He refused to let anyone make him feel guilty about his decision. He'd already given Emma everything he had, years of self-doubt, trying to be enough, and she'd thrown it all away. Instead of expecting James to save her, she had to accept responsibility for her own actions. The calls and mails gradually slowed and eventually stopped completely. It seemed that everyone had finally understood James was serious, that he'd moved on, that he wouldn't get pulled back in. And that's when he really felt at ease. For the first time in years, James's life seemed normal. He had friends, his job, his routines. He'd recreated his life on his own terms. It wasn't lavish or glamorous, but it was his. Ironically, James found himself rediscovering joy in the small things he had overlooked when he was married. He began reading novels that he had planned to read for years. He cooked his own meals. He took long walks, and for the first time, he felt liberated. He didn't need anybody's approval. He wasn't always concerned about someone else's happiness. For once, he arrived first. Every now and then, James would come across someone who knew them both. They'd say, "Hey, whatever happened to her?" He would respond briefly, politely, and change the subject. He didn't need to revisit that part of his life. It wasn't like he was hiding anything. James had previously perfected the capacity to abandon her. The last he heard, things were still not going well for Emma. She was jumping between her parents' house and sleeping on friends' couches. She couldn't keep a consistent job. Occasionally, someone James barely communicated with would message him, saying she needed aid from anyone who would listen. Some even suggested that she was still hoping he would reconsider, that maybe one day he'd alter his mind and play father to her child. But that wasn't going to happen. James had worked too hard to reconstruct his life. She'd made her bed, and he wasn't going to be the one picking up the pieces. Nothing could bring him back into that chapter. He was finished. In the end, James believed he found the closure he needed. Emma was now facing the repercussions of her own actions. And he, for the first time since she departed, felt entirely and really free. He'd finally let go of the weight she had left behind. And you know what? James was pleased, not in a big, dramatic way, just content. And it was enough. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.